Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? So here's how it's going to work tonight. First of all, thank you everybody for being here. I'll just tell you how it's going to work. I'm going to give a AV presentation about my new book, Back to Our Future, which you can see right there. And then Nathan and I are going to sort of go back and forth on some questions. And I asked Nathan to be here because some of his work is an inspiration for some of my work. And so I really appreciate you being here. And then we're going to take questions from the audience. But before we begin, I just want to do some of my own thank yous. I want to obviously thank In These Times for organizing this event. I want to thank the University of Illinois at Chicago and the Jane Addams Hull House for hosting us here. I want to thank C-SPAN BookTV for covering this event. I obviously want to thank Nathan again and the Onion AB Club. And I want to thank all of you for being here and for being interested in this book. The name of the book is Back to Our Future, How the 1980s Explain the World We Live in Now. And to make this presentation a little bit fun, I've included a kind of a trivia contest, not really a contest, but see if you can answer the trivia questions as we go through this. The overall thesis of the book is, as the subtitle says, it's that the 1980s, and in specific, both the political and pop culture of the 1980s, still very much informs the way we think about the world today. And it should be pretty obvious, and I'll just start with the first slide. And this slide took forever to make. And I did make all of these slides, and they took absolutely forever to make, so hopefully you'll like them. It's pretty obvious, it should be pretty obvious to anybody that the 1980s is, wait a minute, let me turn this on here. That would be helpful. That the 1980s is back. And here are some examples of how the 1980s are back, at least in our popular culture. All right, so we have Top Gun, and they're remaking Top Gun now. You've got Rambo, they just remade Rambo. These are just some examples, and I won't read them all out, but Tron, you know, the A-Team, G.I. Joe, Hulk Hogan, back in the 80s, he's now kind of a reality TV celebrity. The Lakers and the Celtics and the championship. Apple was big, then it went away for a while, now Apple's big again. So it should be pretty obvious that the 1980s is back. And for various reasons, I argue in the book, it is back. And I don't think it's just because of the nostalgia factor, although that's certainly a factor. Also, there's some coincidences. I had mentioned on my radio show a couple days ago the weird coincidence, although you may see it not just as a coincidence, that 25 years ago, almost to the exact week, and certainly to the exact month, the United States military was bombing Libya, and the world was wrapped with its attention about a nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl. Those two things happened almost exactly 25 years ago to the month. So as much of this is pop culture, some of it is very, very real. And what I argue in the book is that the popular culture of the 1980s, the iconography of the 1980s, in many ways has inspired the way we look at real-world events and how real-world, I guess you would call them, actors behave today. So here are just, again, some examples, right? You've got the main character from Top Gun. This was replicated by George Bush, quite obviously. You had Rambo in Afghanistan. You have a war in Afghanistan. And a lot of the way we describe it is about the Rambos in Afghanistan. Obviously, Gordon Gekko becomes Bernie Madoff and all the ripoff artists on Wall Street. The evil guy from Tron, I'm only half joking here, kind of is Mark Zuckerberg. The A-Team, the idea of the private contractor that you have to hire to fix your problems for you, is kind of, in some ways, Blackwater, or at least our reliance on private contractors and how we think about private contractors. And the evil guy, Cobra, in G.I. Joe, was a very clear, and which was interesting in the research for the book, was a very clear allusion to Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. What I argue in the book is that these images, these stories became powerful in the 1980s and enduring because of certain structural changes that were happening in our economy. And I told Nathan by email that I was going to do this. I stole and used one of the cover graphics of Nathan's book to sort of highlight how this happened. But an argument in the book is that things changed in the 1980s in a way that made the storylines and the iconography of the 1980s stick in a way that they never had. And so here's some examples. And there's your graphic. That's Nathan's cover. The 1980s was the first decade that most Americans had a TV, a VCR, and a cable system in their home, and almost half had video game systems in their home. The 1980s was also the time of the rise of synergy. And these two things are connected. Synergy meaning you see products across multiple platforms. You see stories across multiple platforms. So there's Mr. T cereal, and there's an E.T. commercial for the Happy Meal E.T. So the stories, the ideological stories, and we'll get into what those stories were, but the ideological stories in pop culture were being told in multiple platforms, in multiple venues, in a country that was more saturated with that media than ever. And you also had total integration by mid-1980. By 1983, mergers meant 50 companies, just 50 companies, controlled most newspapers, magazines, TV stations, and movie studios. So you have an entire architecture for the first time where the stories of pop culture and politics can be sold to us in a way, and sold in particular to children in a way that's more integrated and synergized than ever before. So here's what I mean by a land of confusion, right? And there's the Phil Collins thing from A Land of Confusion. This is sociological research. This was a long story in the Boston Globe, sociological research that we've learned since the 1980s. TV and movie characters can shape how we look at real-world events. Fiction, in fact, can shape our perceptions of the world even more than reality, and especially among children. And we've learned that since the 1980s. And what's particularly important, in addition to the saturation, the synergization, the integration from the 1980s, was the fact that a lot of pop culture was beginning to rip straight from news headlines. This is a quote from a video game executive in the 1980s, just to highlight what I'm saying about that. Coin-op designers take anything remotely in the news and make it a game. And here are some examples. This is Operation Wolf, Contra, Guerrilla. These are 1980s video games. So the point here is just to say that not only did you have an integrated, really top-down instrument to sell everyone, and particularly children, certain storylines, but you had many of those entertainment products actually stealing right from the real-world headlines to blur the distinction between reality and fiction. So, the first chapter in my book looks at how this played out and how the 1980s revised and changed our views of the 1950s and the 1960s. Because this, I argue, and I think everybody who's been following politics would probably acknowledge, this continues to be the battle that frames our politics, right? Everything seems to be the 50s versus the 60s. And I don't think it's the actual 1950s versus the actual 1960s. It's, I argue in the book, it's the 1980s version of the 1950s versus the 1980s version of the 1960s. And these two characters, through this one actor, Michael J. Fox, I think epitomizes what we were being told in the 1980s about the 1950s and the 1960s. So let's start with Marty McFly. Here's Marty McFly. So let's think about the storyline of the movie Back to the Future. One of the most popular movies of the 1980s, a total cultural touchstone. Here's the storyline of Michael J. Fox. He is a teenager fleeing modernity. And what does modernity look like to Michael J. Fox? What does modernity look like to Alex, I'm mixing up the characters, Marty McFly. I don't know if we can hear the audio. Is the audio working? I don't think the audio is working. Can we see if the audio can work? Do we have the tech guys to see if